The richest people do not pay the highest tax rates. In our minds, in our public perception, we always think that we have progressive tax rates. We do not. We do not have progressive tax rates. Well, I want to first show you the top of the iceberg. There is, in case you're interested in the billionaires, there is an interesting open access source, the website of the Forbes. They publish every day an update on the ranking of the Forbes billionaires list. I imagine that the guys who are here on top every morning wake up and go and see where they are. But it's actually this figure, Elon Musk, 420 billion. The last time I gave this presentation in March, it was $100 billion fewer. So he gained between March and now $100 billion. I mean, what is 100 billion? What is that? Do you know what that is? No, because so the best way to try to kind of capture what it is to think of the value of a house, a nice house in the area where you live. I think most of us can think of a house of, say, 1 million. Well, 1 billion is 1,000 times 1 million. So 1,000 times a really nice house. 400,000 really nice houses. And then you start to see what the equivalence is of. I mean, another way to kind of make this understandable for our brains is to recalculate that in the equivalence of a wage. How much should you earn per hour if you work all your life 50 hours a week? And how much then would be your hourly salary in order to get this amount? I mean, when I wrote my book, I can't remember exactly, but I think he had 290 billion, and I haven't checked the number, but I think he earned something like $220,000 an hour. So now it would probably be like, I don't know, 350. I mean, if you like maths, you can use this as an exercise. So that means there is a top that has just like unbelievably masses of wealth. So we are also talking about really different numbers. Now, why is this the case? There are many explanations, but I think a very important explanation is what scholars call the neoliberal wave since the end of the 70s or the 80s, which has led to privatization and deregulation, but also importantly to tax cuts. And of course, if you are taxed, and your taxes are lower, you end up having more. And what we now see, what this graph shows, and this graph comes from a report by the French economist Gabriel Zuckman. These are the tax rates that different groups pay. The United States is in red, the Netherlands, which is where I come from, is in yellow, and then you have Italy and France. And so every block is 10% of the population. So you see, let's take the United States, that it's actually almost flat. It goes up a tiny little bit, and then surprisingly, at the end, it goes down again. The Netherlands is actually pretty horrible, because you see that it's from like 90 to 95% of the population, it's like almost flat. Actually, the poorest have very high marginal tax rates, and then it drops. The richest people do not pay the highest tax rates. In our minds, in our public perception, we always think that we have progressive tax rates. We do not. We do not have progressive tax rates. And we had progressive tax rates in the past. At some point, the highest marginal tax rate in the US was in the 90s, was 91%, and then at some point in the war, even higher. And now all these tax rates have dropped. And what is also important about tax rates is that tax on labor is now much higher than tax on the income of capital or of capital. And what are the sources of wealth of the most rich people? First, enterprises, so capital, as we call it in theory. Second, inheritances, also capital, another type of capital. So that means that they really overwhelmingly have their income streams not from labor, but from capital. So that means that how we tax labor and how we tax capital, it's very important to understand how inequality is moving. All right. Now, in this book that I wrote, I do two things. I examine the reasons why this is undesirable. So basically, I ask the question, okay, we have this inequality, we have this history. Is this now a problem? And to answer this question, we probe for the reasons. And I will give you the reasons in the remainder of the talk. And then, based on those reasons, I argue for what I call limitarianism, which is the view that there should be an upper limit to how much personal wealth each person can have. Limitarianism is what philosophers call an ideal. So it's not something we're going to implement today or tomorrow. It's an aspirational ideal for which we think, or at least I believe, and I have argued, that there are good reasons, but it may be that it's not feasible to implement it all the way, not in the short run, perhaps not in the long run, but that doesn't mean that it can perform a role, for example, in our public discourse. So that is when you think about limitarianism in the public sphere. But then you also can have limitarianism in your private life, namely just asking the question, when do I have enough? And there are actually currently multimillionaires in the world that are asking this question. There's the Enough project run by wealth holders where they're really trying to have that conversation among themselves, like, when do we have enough? And these are people that may, for example, have, just giving an example, 200 million, and they go through a process where they ask themselves and have a conversation with their peers, how much should I keep and how much should I give away and how should I give it away? So there are these, I think, this idea of just thinking it's enough, that is, I think, the most important thing. Okay, so here are the reasons. I list here 6 reasons. There are more reasons. These are the ones on which in each of those reasons I've written a chapter. The first one is that there's a historical argument, namely, some of those very large wealth fortunes have been accumulated in unjust ways. And what I try to do in that chapter is I start from cases where I'm assuming we all agree that wealth should not have been created. Slavery. If you have become rich because you enslaved people and you didn't compensate them properly, then that wealth, you should just not have it. I'm assuming and I'm hoping we all agree on this. So that's a clear case. But then throughout the chapter, I go to cases that may be like already where we have less unanimity. For example, labor conditions. Do we think that Jeff Bezos, who was on the list, who has working conditions that I would find unacceptably, do we think that because he sticks to the law that this is fine? Or do we think that the working conditions and the wages should be higher? Well, if the working conditions and the wages had been better and the wages had been higher, his profits would be lower. So it just goes like you divide up what you produce together in the company, and the question is, how much do you take as the owner of the company and how much do you share with the people who do the work? At the end of that chapter on historical arguments, I come to tax evasion and tax avoidance. What's the difference? Tax evasion is whereby you really try to dodge taxes in an illegal way. So you really try to not report taxes or have them in tax havens. Tax avoidance is where you try to make optimal use of the existing rules to minimize your taxes. And often when we argue with our politicians, so let's take the earlier slide we had, how come these people pay so few taxes? Because they evade. No, they avoid their taxes. Yeah, and I'll tell you why I always, because the line between tax evasion and tax avoidance is blurred. And when we talk with politicians and we say, look, you should really tax capital more. And then they say, but then the money goes to tax havens, etc. So basically they say this is tax avoidance, but not tax evasion. It's legal, even if we don't like it. What they do not say is that that line has shifted over time. How has that line shifted? It's because there is a certain industry, which scholars call the wealth defense industry, that has shifted those regulations. And they advise super rich people on how to pay as little taxes as possible. So the problem is that, like, say, in the not the 1%, but you could say the next 9%, they're smart people who spend their lives for a nice wage, making sure that those in the 1% pay as little taxes as possible. And they do that by lobbying so that the law changes more favorably in their advantage, but they also do that by advising on how they can get away with paying fewer taxes. So that's the first reason why I think we should not have such high fortunes, because some of that money is stained. The second reason is what philosophers call a classic utilitarian argument. Nobody needs so much money for their well-being. I mean, and there are philanthropists who say this too. So if you have, say, personally, I mean, $1 million. Okay, if you live in London, your house may be worth $1 million. But 2 million, what are you going to do with the next million? And with the next million, what are you going to do when you have 100 million? You can use it for very luxurious consumption, which you don't really need for a good quality of life. You can use it for status goods, or you can use it just to keep investing it, to keep it further accumulating so that you get higher in that list of billionaires. But you don't need that money for a good life. And there are multimillionaires and billionaires who actually think this is the most important reason why they do not want to keep their money. They say, I cannot, in a world in which so many are suffering, I cannot keep all those millions. And in the US, there was a guy called Chuck Feedy who had 4 billion, and he gave away all of it. He kept 2 million. And all the rest he gave away, and he basically made it into a project. I mean, there's lots to say about this, because the way he made his money, I believe, falls a bit under reason one. But so that means, and that's also, I think, why, even if politically nothing changes, why I think we should embrace limitarianism in our personal lives voluntarily, in an ethical way, because we don't need that money, and other people can really use it very well. The third reason is that extreme wealth concentration and wealth inequality undermine democracy. Now, in that chapter, I give you all the different reasons that scholars, political scientists, and others have laid out, the mechanisms by which people turn economic power into political power. Now, I think I can just say, look at the USA. You just see it happening there. You see how a class of billionaires has basically bought themselves into politics and is now using the executive branch of government to execute their own plans. So the mechanism that we see here is, so the mechanism that, there are many mechanisms, but the three most important ones I think are direct donations. So that's what we've seen with Musk, who gave 200 million or something to Trump. But it's actually funny that I found a quote in an interview where Trump was interviewed when he was still an entrepreneur and not a politician. And he was asked by a journalist, why do you give both to the Democrats and the Republicans? And the answer he gave was, because then whoever is in the White House, I can call them. I mean, Trump is brutally honest. Well, there you get it, the honest answer. So that's one mechanism, donations. The other one is lobbying. I mean, lobbying, I checked the register at the European Union. 3/4 of the lobbyists lobby for enterprises, 1/4 lobby for civil service, not civil service, for the basically citizens. So that means lobbying is predominantly done by enterprises who have wealth. And then the third mechanism, in addition to lobbying and donations, is buying your influence in the public sphere. So if you have a large media empire and you really push a certain ideological view, and I mean, that was, of course, what happened under the first Trump administration, that Fox and the White House were like two hands on one belly. And yeah, you basically no longer, as a citizen, get the information you need from the press to be able to exercise your citizens, right, and to have a strong democracy. So those are the three reasons why I think extreme wealth concentration undermines democracy, and why I think the US is now in such a dangerous situation. The fourth reason is that extreme wealth concentration does not go together with ecological sustainability. In theory, it could. If we look at the data, it doesn't. So let us take as an example average greenhouse gas emissions per person. In Europe, we have like around, it depends a bit whether you look at consumption-based or production-based, but we have roughly 9 tons emissions per person per year. The average in the world is 6 tons per person per year. Africa, 1 ton per person per year. America, almost 20 tons per person per year. The 1% in the world, 101 tons per person per year. Billionaires, 3,000 tons up to 8,000 tons per person per year. The group of billionaires is growing. So it's not possible to have the lifestyles that they have. And then we haven't yet talked about the climate effects of their investments. So that is, I think, really a problem that, yeah, the consumption, I mean, the precise argument is that it's the consumption that leads to ecological sustainability, but wealth is very strongly correlated with consumption.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.